Hello everybody, welcome back to Exponential Finance, the podcast covering finance, technology and innovation, from our home in Japan and beyond. Code Chrysalis is a software engineering immersive and consultancy in Tokyo, teaching computer science fundamentals and modern web application development through a project-based curriculum that promotes career longevity, autonomy, and teamwork. Fan is a co-founder and the Chief Technology Officer of Code Chrysalis, and Mio Maeshima a recent graduate. In this conversation, we are looking at software engineering and computer science, the role of diversity, and the digital skills gap that Japan is facing. With Maeshima-san being a trained translator and interpreter, we are also touching on the transformation of one's own career, possibly later in life, and the role bootcamps like Code Chrysalis can play in such transitions. And now, please welcome Fan and Mio Maeshima.
All right, good morning. Here this morning with Fan, who's the co-founder and CTO at Code Chrysalis, and Maeshima-san, who I know from a prior life and who has now turned into a software engineer. And so we want to talk about two different careers in coding or software engineering. First of all, it's great. We could label this women in technology as well. So what's your history? How did you get excited about software engineering?
Thank you for having me on. How did I get started with software engineering? It was really by accident. I actually used to work in finance. So I was working in commodities trading, and I really didn't like the job. And I was trying to figure out, how to get out of it. Eventually started learning how to code, seeing, technology being really where, the future was at or is at. And so I thought it would be extremely important for me to understand more about technology. And so I decided to learn how to code. One thing led to another, and I eventually learned enough to be a software engineer. So I moved to Silicon Valley, started working as a software engineer. It was really there that I discovered bootcamps and this whole idea of alternative education programs that could really hack occupations and hack education, essentially help people make these big career changes. Before I knew about bootcamps, I did not think that it was possible to become a software engineer without going to university or without having been coding since you were 12 years old. What I really love, especially about bootcamps, is one, it's a very creative sort of educational space. We're looking at what is needed to become a software engineer and how can we do it in the shortest amount of time possible with quality. And the second thing is it has a direct impact on the field in that, instead of a coding program for children where we have to wait years and years and years or decades for them to make it into the job market, we're able to do that in under a year's time, essentially. If you take a woman who has never coded before, it takes them about a year to go through our program and make that career change. If they're fast, it could take like 6 months, which we've seen before. That sort of immediate impact into adding more women or adding more other underrepresented groups is also, to me, incredibly exciting.
So would you say there is a difference between a programmer and a software engineer then? So there's still a space for academic education and a 4-year curriculum in computer science to be really deep in the domain. Maybe that goes more into the technical architect role than. Not everybody needs to do that to be effective and to earn a living developing software. So there's the more lightweight bootcamp approach of actually practical knowledge. And I went to a polytechnic myself, so much more practical than academic. There is a space for that. But would you draw that differentiation, or it doesn't really matter to you?
So I wouldn't draw that differentiation. I think a lot of computer science courses are not producing software engineers. They're producing computer scientists. And there's a huge difference between computer science as an academic pursuit and software engineering. And in fact, companies have hired us because they realize that universities are not preparing students for the engineering field. Part of my business is going and training companies, training up their engineering teams. In fact, we have trained computer scientists up to become software engineers. And that disconnect is, I think, where we fit in really well because, our program does cover the computer science fundamentals that you need to know to be successful at your job. And if there is deeper topics to learn, that's also something that people can do on their own. Like you don't necessarily need a degree to dive deeper into these topics. With all the different resources now on the internet, textbooks, books, there's really no excuse not learning something and just saying like, oh, my excuse is I didn't go to university. And you can learn that stuff on your own. The way that I really look at the industry here is, and the industry all over the world, is universities, companies, people, whenever they talk about software engineers, they are only focusing on the technical side of things. What are the programming languages you know? What are the technologies you know? What algorithms or whatever? And that is important too, don't get me wrong, but I think the whole other aspect of having communication skills, being able to work well on a team, being able to identify and drive business value, being able to give suggestions, having autonomy, I think those are severely overlooked all across the board by companies, universities, people, etc. Those skills are just as important, if not more important, than the technical skills. And that's another big thing that we are pushing as Code Chrysalis. You can really teach anyone to code, but can you teach people to be able to learn on their own, to be able to see their value, to be able to push value in companies? Like that is the much harder thing to do.
Understood. Thank you. And it's an interesting differentiation between computer scientists and software engineer. I like that. And I want to come back to the team aspect probably later a bit. So, Maeshima-san, we talked a bit about 1 year program to really become a proficient programmer and effective career change as well. And so that's been the case for you. We met 3 years ago, 4 years ago almost, when you were translating one of my FinTech presentations. Thank you for that. That was great. And now you went through the bootcamp. When I think about the different sides of my brain, I probably feel I'm an analytical person and I struggle even learning my Japanese vocabulary and all the kanjis. So it's almost like two different minds. And the change from doing translation to becoming a software engineer is an amazing shift for me. So please talk a bit about your interest, what made you do it, and what was the experience in going through that bootcamp?
Thank you very much for having me for the first place. So I got really interested in programming through my exposure as an interpreter to the industry. I was always translating for those people who are creating things out of their ideas. And I said to myself, wow, they are really making things happening. They're making the difference really. And I felt that, well, I'm living in the same age and these people are really riding the wave and make things happening. I wanted to join the team because often those people are just fantastic as people too. So I asked a lot of people in that industry, where can I learn programming? They didn't know, they didn't have any clue. They said, well, universities, you don't really learn how to program. So they didn't recommend that to me. And they said, it's just 4 years and it's too long for you. And then they couldn't find any other answers as well. They didn't think of any other programming school, so to say, where they can really program to be able to really work. So I didn't have this answer for many years. On one day, I found on the Twitter a tweet about a Code Chrysalis immersive course. This person graduated from the bootcamp. And so, wow, there's an opportunity. And then I had that idea for some time because of the COVID pandemic. I had a lot of free time last year. So I said to myself, well, this is the chance. This is the time I have to grab. I joined first the foundation course and tried to see how interested I can be. And I found that very, very fascinating. So I continued on to be in the real bootcamp. Yeah. Talking about the big gap that people tend to see between translation and the technology, when I look around in my teammates, I mean, the people that I studied together with, they came from different fields. Technology is in front of us and it's really fascinating. So whoever lives in this world now and who kind of likes to make things are naturally attracted, at least once, to programming, I think. It's very natural. Another thing I can talk about, the translating interpretation. In doing that, I would try to understand what's going on and then try to analyze what's going on and then translate. In programming too, you have to analyze what's going on in the code. You have to understand what is the problem and then make things. So there is some similarity in both fields. I try to observe and identify what is the core message, what is the problem, the core problem, and then process it. So I think there's a lot of similarity.
We're also clearly living in an age where we're all hopefully becoming much older than our parents. And by extension, our working life should be longer. And so even at a later stage in our career, it feels natural that we don't have one job for our whole life anymore. So we need to reinvent ourselves. And what used to be the retirement age for my parents is maybe then the third stage for our careers, and doing something new should become normal. I don't feel it is quite normal yet. So I'm still completely amazed and impressed by your intellectual curiosity. And yes, technology is around us, but it's not like everybody says, I need to understand this now in much more detail, and I really want to dive in. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation. I find it a good example. And we always say you need to have diversity examples in technology so that people can follow. I think you're a very good example to follow for others right around our age group to say it's possible.
I would be really proud to say it when I find a job, actually. Talking about diversity, during this programming bootcamp, I was thrown into this international team. We had to work together as a team, and this kind of soft skill was hugely developed during this program. One thing I realized is that a lot of Japanese companies are missing out huge opportunity by not being diverse. When I job hunt, I see the clear difference among companies. I kind of feel that a lot of companies or Japanese people are afraid of diversity because they've never tasted it. They've never done it themselves. I was afraid to do a lot of teamwork, team projects. Although I worked as an interpreter, I was not the party to the meeting, right? I was just translating as an outsider. But here, I was a party to the team. I had to be really actively engaging with other people. It wasn't that intimidating for me, but I was not 100% comfortable with it initially. But then once you did it, you enjoy it. It's so much you can do and gain from the diversity. People tend to be afraid of what they have not experienced in the past. But once you experience it, in most cases, you realize that it's not that scary at all. It's actually something you enjoy. Japanese companies are really missing out huge opportunity by not being diverse between genders, between nationality, and between age brackets too.
Jan, continue with what Maeshima-san said in terms of culture in software engineering in Japan, which is also very specific for me, having seen IT departments and engineering companies and system integrators in other markets. How do you view that, and what needs to change to make it more productive? Because arguably, Japan is still a country that manufactures things, so physical things, and the services side and the software side of things is not quite up to the level that the manufacturing sector is, I would postulate.
So Japan is a very hardware-heavy, nation, and the hardware practices and methodologies and mindsets really, I think, drive the direction of software. Problem is, software is a completely different game. That's where Japanese companies really struggle. And they struggle on a few fronts. One of the ones that I can think of right now is there's this sort of viewpoint that's pretty big in Japan that you need to know what the customer is going to anticipate. I find that there is some hesitance in asking a user or a client, like, how do you like this? Because Japanese teams want to get it right the first time. And that's really difficult to do in software. Because if you ask what a customer wants, customer doesn't necessarily know. It's your job as a software engineer to understand their problems and then give them a solution. Oftentimes, what goes on is there's this sort of lack of feedback that teams are getting from their users because they want to get it right the first time. Whereas if we look at software and how it's created, it's a bit more agile in stereotypical Silicon Valley companies, where you understand the user, you understand their problems, you come up with a solution, you build a small part of that solution and you test it. And then you learn from that, you build a little bit more, and then you test it again. So it's like this iterative de-risking
It's also that from a mindset perspective and from a cost perspective, obviously fixing software is much easier than fixing hardware. So if you have a 2-year planning process or so for a car and you make a mistake, it's much harder to fix than promoting new software into production.
Also, software is so difficult. There are so many things that can go wrong. There's just so many things to think about when you're creating software that you really do need a diverse team, because you need some diverse minds to think about ways that that something might go wrong, potential situations you need to account for. Software is, I think, very different because a lot of the software that we use, it's used, not just by a specific demographic, but it's used by many different kinds of people. So we need software that has the input of different mindset and different experiences. Numerous studies have been done on the diversity of teams and how that impacts performance. And they've all been overwhelmingly positive about how diversity drives revenue, how companies with more diverse teams fare better under many circumstances. So I think that aspect is really important.
Maeshima-san, you were agreeing a lot when Jan said so many things can go wrong with software, and I wonder about your experience going through that then as well.
Here is where having diversity really helps. For one thing is that if your organization is diverse and accepting people from, all kinds of countries and different cultures, you are exposed to that software mindset. And then you would realize, oh, this is the world that we have to function in. For example, talking about the difference between manufacturing companies, which were being 100% quality is really almost like an expectation to try push things out in the market as soon as possible and get the feedback and build that into your product in the next version. One good example is the application that tells you whether you have been exposed to the close contacts to the people who got the COVID virus. They found out that Android application was not working well. And I think it probably because most of the designers, most of the engineers were using iPhones. And then the reaction from that episode was, so the ministry realized that it was not functioning well for the Android users. First, I'm sure there's tons of Android users in the ministry itself. And I just wonder why they didn't notice it until so late. And two, the government is going to penalize somebody because of this bad thing. That's wrong. I mean, software is something that is improved over feedback from users. And that's very different from, manufacturing industry where quality has to be 100%. So there are two very different paradigms. So penalizing somebody for the software not being 100% fantastic on day one is wrong. It's a wrong approach, I think. It just intimidates people for making not perfect, but something functional. Of course, by learning programming, I realized how difficult programming itself, software development is. And a lot of people don't get it. A lot of people expect your application to be like Toyota car. That's flawless, but it's a very different paradigm, I think.
Sorry, I want to just piggyback off of that. Software usually is not created with bad intentions, right? It's not like teams are saying, like, we're going to create a product that discriminates. Inevitably, some issues arise because you're not living another person's experience. It's not something that you realize. There's all sorts of examples in our world about situations where because of lack of diversity, it's caused a lot of problems. And they might be like small, funny things. They might be big and harmful. Even on the hardware side, when airbags were first invented in cars, women and children died because the engineers were these like large men. And they didn't think, oh, with a lighter weight person, the physics might be a bit different. So, airbags in the beginning were very dangerous. Did they intend to kill women and children? No, of course not. But that inevitably happens when you don't have diverse voices in the room. Other examples, experiments for testing the safety of chemicals and drugs and household cleaners are oftentimes only tested on male metrics and not female metrics. But of course, men and women, our bodies are very different, right? Women have more fat, which hold chemicals longer. So that could be causing some problems that maybe we don't know about. When it comes to software, a lot of times software, and specifically machine learning, it uses historical data to learn how to make future decisions. As we know, historical data is pretty biased usually. And a great example of this was very recently, actually, in I think 2019, 2018 or 2019, Amazon was working on an internal HR bot that would decide what applicants maybe get moved on to the interview stage, or even I think it had to do also with who was getting a promotion. What they found out was that this bot favored men over women. So if this bot saw that on your resume as a woman, you went to an all-girls university, it deducted points from you and it made you lower ranked. So all of these little things. Luckily, Amazon caught this. They caught it in the testing phase before it was deployed company-wide. Because technology is oftentimes using historical data, what technology can do is amplify those biases on a much larger level beyond what we were capable of before. That is when it gets a bit dangerous, and that's when it starts impacting real lives. Very luckily, Amazon caught this before it impacted actual people. But what I want to raise the question of is what has not been caught? What biased technologies, accidentally biased technologies, are making decisions that are impacting our lives, and we don't know about it? They're impacting them and they're still biased because the people making them haven't realized this. Maybe the teams are not diverse enough and they haven't caught this. So that is something that really concerns me. What are we interacting with day to day that might be impacting us in ways that maybe are not optimal? This impacts beyond women. This impacts everybody. It is our priority. It is our responsibility to right those issues and find those bugs.
I want to challenge the team concept a bit, simply because in software engineering, there's still this mythical hero programmer, this super productive person who's got 10x productivity over anybody else. And in the market, everybody seems to be looking for that person as a team lead architect, the superstar, as a technical co-founder, or whatever. So is that just a myth, or do these people exist and they have their niche in the market somewhere?
These people exist. They're not always the best people to work with. And in fact, the other thing is it's just terrible business practice to have your engineering team be reliant on one person. There's always the bus test. How many people have to die on a bus before you have to shut everything down? If that one engineer, if they decide to change companies or something happens to them, if they're sick, you don't want your business reliant on that one person. It's also just not going to actually create the productivity that you want if you have one star engineer, bunch of engineers that don't really have much skill or don't feel empowered to showcase what they can do. That also is not going to be a very productive situation because that one person, no matter how good they are, I mean, they're still one person. Some people are surprised to know that the more senior that you climb as a software engineer, the less coding that you should do. Because at that point, you are far better off scaling yourself. Your point as a senior engineer is to be able to scale yourself, getting the more junior software engineers up to speed faster. So that instead of you doing all the coding, you can really delegate, spread out, and then make sure that everyone is working at a high speed. And I think that's something that a lot of engineering teams don't understand here. Senior engineers, the more senior you get, it's better off for that person to be a mentor or assisting everyone else and making sure that they're all on track.
I view engineering programming as an ideal occupation to be done remotely and to be done basically any time of the day, right, with the constraints of clearly you need to touch base with your team and at certain times. But it actually is an occupation that can provide the flexibility and a career path for, right, whether it's men or women who ultimately take on that responsibility, doesn't matter, but to work flexibly, to combine family and the career, and to provide much better opportunities to the people who are, and in Japan that tends to be the women taking care of the family and dropping out of the workforce. So is that a very male view, or is it something that the two of you would agree with to at least some extent?
Well, one thing for sure is that because of this pandemic, many things became online. For example, the bootcamp became available online. I could start learning programming because the courses were available in online fashion. It is true that it's helpful for people who have to take care of the families to have opportunity online is great. But having said that, still I realize majority of the at least startups in Japan at least are started by men and expect people to devote their lives to the business. It's an expectation of that you devote your whole life into this. For example, if they look at their website, they talk about how wonderful their workplace is by showing that they have parties, they have camps, together retreats. I can't do it because I have my daughter, for example. But still, a flexibility in terms of hours is a great thing because you can be home at early hours in the evening, and that's a great thing. And I think each program does provide that.
I think it's a nice thought, but I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. I think a change in societal mindset needs to happen because saying like, oh, because you get to work from home, it'll be easier, for women. I think it's just sounds like a really good excuse to have women continue doing the household work as well as hold down a job. Mio, as you know, programming requires a lot of focus time. It's not a job where you can quickly do for 30 minutes and then go do something else and then come back to. It requires a lot of mental focus because if you get your focus broken, it takes a while for you to get back to where you were. And so if you have young children or if you have to do the dishes here and the laundry there, you're never going to get anything done. You're not going to be very productive. Even if all the women knew how to code, I really don't think it would make much of a difference because ultimately they're still stuck with the bulk of the housework along with this new expectation of oh, because you can code, you should also make some money. I think devalues the work that people are doing. I think instead we need to normalize life events and stop the expectation that Misho was talking about that, you need to devote your life to a company. It's important for everyone to see each other as people and to be understanding that our lives are so complex that we have relationships outside of work. We have children, we want to have children, we have partners, we have families where people might be sick, we might get sick. And I think when you take into that, when you allow people to be people, I think you get better work results.
Here it's probably looking at FaceTime rather than looking at output. And that was what I had a bit in mind when I asked the question, because I was lucky enough to work in environments that were very output oriented. And it didn't matter if you need to leave early, take care of your kids, or you want to be there for a baseball game or performance in school. Who cares? You probably still need to get your work done. And if you do it later at night, that's fine.
I find that, oftentimes with maybe more traditional Japanese teams, people don't talk about their personal lives very much. And I think that's so stressful because, if you're going through a divorce or having something terrible happen, it's so difficult to compartmentalize that when you go into work. And it's going to affect, that stress is going to affect you. So I think it's really important to be upfront about what's going on and for people to also be understanding, right? I think the pandemic has made the more human element maybe more visible, and I've really appreciated that. I've actually really enjoyed seeing people's children or their pets or their partners be in the screen behind them, right? And it's oh, that's so cool. And seeing where they live, seeing them in their natural habitat. And I've really enjoyed that. I think it's helped normalize things a bit. I love it if a kid pops up in the back and says something funny. I think it turns meetings into just a much more laid back and happier space. At Code Chrysalis, in Mio's class, there were 3 mothers actually. One of the students brought her son over and I thought it was great each time the son came. He was really well behaved. He was able to see his mother give presentations, build cool things. And then also, I think it de-stressed the atmosphere because people going through our program, it's a very stressful situation. There's a lot of deadlines. There's a lot of technical frustrations. And it's just nice during breaks or during lunch or, whenever you're really frustrated to look over and see a kid laughing and being happy. And so I think if companies were more open to allowing these things, I think it would make work a lot better.
Maeshima-san, you said you had a daughter.
Yeah.
So what did your daughter say about mom picking up software engineering now?
Well, I brought my daughter to Code Chrysalis once, yeah. I thought it was great education for her to see her mother working seriously. I mean, really throughout the nights many times. As a mother, as a parent, I think it's a great thing to be able to show yourself working hard instead of telling them to work hard. I was dead serious about what I was studying, and she could see it. And so she trimmed Christmas tree on behalf of myself. I didn't have any time for that without me telling her to do it. I think she was proud of me, proud of her mother working very hard. She liked me as an interpreter, and at the same time, she likes me as a software engineer, somebody who is really studying very hard, regardless of the age. She was overhearing me talking with my teammates during many projects. She knew that there's an international team, Japanese and people from other countries working together, trying to create something together. And it was a great preparation for her future, because this is going to be the way of working, whatever profession she chooses in the future.
Did it inspire her in a way to say, I want to try this out as well?
Not yet. She didn't say software programming yet, software development yet. I think she's such a cool thing to be on an international team, to be working with people from all kinds of culture.
So obviously we're facing the 2025 digital cliff, and at least 200,000 software engineers short. Japan is at that time. With Code Chrysalis, you're obviously contributing to changing that and filling that gap. I think Google made a big commitment as well to say we need to train many more people with programming skills. What's the vision, the way forward for you, Jan, and Code Chrysalis?
As Code Chrysalis, we've always seen ourselves as not just Japan, but using this as our launching pad and then going to hopefully the rest of Asia to change the way that people view software engineers, people view the training and that education. I really appreciate how you brought up the digital cliff. I feel like people are missing another component of that, which is it's not just software engineers that this country needs. It's digital literacy. Being able to type and use a computer to answer emails, to use programs like Zoom or Slack or all these other things. It's that digital literacy that I think that Japan is really lacking. And it's lacking in the next generation, in that a lot of people in their 20s, a lot of children in schools right now, they have very low digital literacy compared to their counterparts in other OECD countries. On average for Japan, the number of computers per household is about 1 computer per household. And that is very low considering that you have usually more than 1 person in a household. Developing just digital literacy is going to be super important. Coding is the next step. We first need people to feel comfortable using technology to find ways to be more efficient in their work, having more things done online rather than using paper. It's not just software engineers. Yes, software engineers are absolutely needed, but you can't have a bunch of software engineers and then people who don't know how to use a computer. In running Code Chrysalis, this is something that we've noticed that we did not expect when we first came here. We do a lot of free events, and in the beginning, we would get young people, like fresh out of university, just started working, new computer young people. One young man, he was about 25 years old, came to one of our free workshops, which is great, trying to better himself. It was on a weekend. I sent a link to his email, and I said, you need to open that link on your computer because it brings you to like the special page that you have to access on your computer. I found out that he had no idea that he could log on to his email account through his computer. And get this, he was using Gmail. And he had a brand new Sony laptop. And it was just mind-blowing that he had not made that connection. It was funny seeing his face when I opened his computer up. He had Chrome installed. He had all the necessary elements. And then I typed in gmail.com. And his mind was just like, oh my God, I didn't know I could do that. It's not that he was dumb. young people just don't use the computer very often here. This is a smartphone generation. So they went straight from nothing to smartphones. In schools here, a lot of assignments and things are still done by hand. Whereas in the US, I don't remember the last time that I wrote an essay by hand after maybe the 4th grade. After that, people were just expecting you to type it up. Whereas here, people write by hand what their essays are. And then when they're doing research on their phones. So it's simple things like that, just like being able to use a computer for those tasks that Japan really needs. Yeah. I find that in digital literacy, people in their 40s and 50s, they're pretty good actually, because they didn't have the smartphones. But it's the younger generations that really need that digital literacy. And that is also something that's quite terrifying, right? You have all these young people going into the workplace. They don't know how to properly use a computer.
I agree. But my daughter has gotten a service from school. It's a public school in Shibuya, but she got one. And so she knows how to do things, sometimes better than I do. So that's great, really great. But I just recently heard that in one area, I don't know where in Japan, students were given iPad, which is fantastic. The use of iPad was so restrictive that when one of the students tried to post the picture with some writings along with it, outside of the use in school, teacher said, don't do that. That really limits the possibility to learn on their own. And one thing I learned as part of the programming course was to really use Googling, Google everything, try to find things on your own. And that's really actually a very important skill now. All those things, which is to explore things on the internet, explore how to use new tools on the internet, is something we need, something the children will need to do in the future and probably now already. And those things is so difficult to teach by one-way lecture type of lessons. You have to learn by exploring things on your own. And also here, diversity really will probably help. People from different cultures and countries where exploring things on the internet is of a norm already. You see it and quickly you understand, okay, that's how you do it. That's where schools and also children and society at large and also companies need to be exposed to people from different cultures. People who are living in the cocoon of closed culture don't realize what's happening outside. It's really shocking. Companies should realize huge opportunity they're missing by trying to source people only from their own country. The biggest difference between those companies who are closed and who are not closed is the speed. The sense of speed is just totally different. One good example is resume. Writing a CV is totally different. In English version, you don't need to have picture. You don't need to have your age. I mean, you can calculate based on the age of the education you get, but still, you don't have to write down your age. You don't have to write down your gender. You don't have to write down how many people you are supporting economically. I mean, do you count those things when you choose people? Probably they're not the most important things. Many things like that will slowing down the productivity of people who are applying and probably for the people who are accepting. And there's so many things like that in Japan. And once you are exposed to different way of doing things, you realize quickly your whole system is so slow.
I think I've taken quite a bit of both your time. I appreciate your comments and your openness in doing this. It opens up lots of opportunities and we can all work as catalysts, hopefully, in driving some change here. If you got excited and want to know more about how to become a software engineer, you know where to find Jan and the Code Chrysalis team. If you need a freshly minted software engineer, Maeshima-san is there as well, in a dual capacity even, multi-skilled, wonderful. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.